this next session, you'll see EmmaEllis and David Rutland being interviewed by Steve Axel. If you enjoy the session, take a selfie and share your digital festival experience on our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram accounts to encourage your friends to join in too. So now, please give a virtual welcome to EmmaEllis and David Rutland.
Resolution: Two Brothers, a Nation in Crisis. Based upon the detailed archives held at Belvoir Castle and drawing on the wealth of primary research, Resolution charts the lives and fortunes of two 18th-century aristocratic brothers, Charles and Robert Manners, orphan sons of the celebrated Marquis of Granby and grandsons of the third Duke of Rutland, against a backdrop of the American War of Independence. Written by David Rutland and EmmaEllis, I'm pleased to say they both join us now, remotely of course, in the digital version of the Red Funnel Isle of Wight Literary Festival. Well, firstly, welcome Your Grace, the Duke of Rutland, from your study in the magnificent Belvoir Castle. So, how did Resolution come about?
It interested me right as a child. I've always wondered why there was a naval officer on the walls of the castle, when most of the time we were either politicians or we were soldiers. And then you saw the paintings of the red tunics, and there was this one blue tunic, which intrigued me as a child. And my father used to get the books up of Lord Robert Manners' letters, and we used to go through them together. I do have something I'd like to say. I've been reflecting upon how Resolution came about, and I'd like to start with a strange fact that I've lived with all my life. One of the things about being a duke that most people don't realise is that the moment you are born, lawyers, accountants and the like start planning for your demise when you've not even yet had a chance to live. To explain what I mean, please bear with me while I go back in time. My home Belvoir Castle dates from Norman times. William the Conqueror bestowed the land to his standard bearer, Robert de Tordini, who built a castle on it in 1067 and named it Belvoir. The local Anglo-Saxons just called it Belvoir, which is why we still pronounce it like that today. My family name is Manners, also originating from Normandy, but my Manners ancestors went first to Northumberland before bringing their name to Belvoir in 1508. At that time, the estate reached its zenith, comprising some 150,000 acres across 11 counties. The Manners family with so much land to their name were made Earls of Rutland by Henry VIII in 1525 and Dukes of Rutland by Queen Anne in 1703. Over the centuries, the Belvoir estate and ducal title passed through primogeniture through a long line of heirs. The moment a new heir was born, lawyers and accountants hopped up and down to make provision for what would happen when the heir would die. It was necessary to know at all times that the estate and title were legally secure. So hopefully you will now see what I mean by the strange fact about my death being talked of before I'd even lived. So you may be wondering, what does this have to do with Resolution, the lives of the two young brothers described within? Again, please bear with me for some more context. Today, the Belvoir estate is down to 16,000 acres, but that is still a significant amount to manage. The castle is the fourth one to stand on the site. It's such a large building that my mother once said she measured walking 5 miles in a day within it. Believe it or not, it has 16 miles of water piping, 8 miles of electric wiring and a roof the equivalent of a 2.5 acre field. To give some perspective, that's half the length of the flight deck of the USS Nimitz. Being now current guardian of all this, because I was born an eldest son and heir, means that my life is not quite my own. I am bound by a deep love of Belvoir and its surrounding land, a love that runs through all the generations of my ancestors. I could never walk away from it, and I hope it will be the same for my oldest son. My second son must make his own way in life, but by contrast, he will be much freer from obligation. Resolution stemmed from a journey of reflection upon such matters, on what it has meant to be a first or second son over the centuries, along with the associated traditions, which were even more life-dictating in the past. First sons were expected to serve in the army while waiting to inherit, whilst younger sons were expected to choose the army, politics, or the cloth. Imagine my curiosity when, as a small boy, I noticed that among the life-size portraits on Belvoir Castle's walls, there was just one that portrayed a formal blue coat amongst all the others that portrayed red-coated army officers or fancy silks and laces of society hosts. The blue-coated young man had his hand on an anchor, and behind him were ships and a stormy sky. My father told me that the portrait was an 18th century depiction of Captain Lord Robert Manners by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Robert had joined the Royal Navy, which was not then fashionable for the aristocracy. I realized that I had an ancestor who had broken the family tradition of serving in the army. I felt drawn to him. I myself wished to break tradition and join the Royal Air Force. My father saw that I was interested in Robert, and he showed me the letters that had been written from on board the various ships Robert had served in. We would sit together reading them, and I was enthralled by the words scrawled across the page, written perhaps as the ship heaved over a wave, and still sparkling with the sand thrown hastily across them to dry the ink. I recall being moved by sensing amongst those lines such a range of emotions, from thrill and excitement to disappointment and frustration, and sometimes even loneliness. Robert was the younger son. His older brother, Charles, inherited the castle and became the fourth Duke of Rutland. Although I myself had more in common with Charles, nonetheless I maintained a feeling of connection with Robert because we were both prepared to be different. My father and I also talked of another curiosity relating to Robert's choice of career. Charles and Robert's father had been the celebrated 18th century army general, the Marquis of Granby, known for his benevolence to wounded servicemen. At one time, over 1,000 pubs across Britain were named Marquis of Granby after him, although many of them sadly are now called the Slug and Lettuce, or some such name. He was said to have been as famous in his day after the 7 Years' War as Nelson later was. Admiration for Granby's dashing, wigless cavalry charge at Warburg, his bald head gleaming in the sun, gave rise to the expression going at it bald-headed. This presented a mystery as to why Robert had not followed in his father's army footsteps. In an age of preferment by connection, surely he would have had all the advantages of Lord Granby's fame. I recall wondering, was Robert an independent spirit, or was he driven to choose the Navy for some other reason? As I grew older, I learned that Robert had been born in 1758, the very same year that Lord Nelson was born and HMS Victory was commissioned. Then I learned that Robert had served in the Victory in 1778, as well as in many sea battles during the days of the sailing navy. But unlike Nelson, Robert had never made it to the glorious days of Trafalgar. He was wounded on the 12th of April 1782 at the Battle of the Saints in the West Indies. He died less than 2 weeks later, just aged 24. Yet it seemed that an aura of heroism surrounded him, and there was even a monument to him and two of his fellow captains in Westminster Abbey. I asked myself, what had this young man really done, and why had he then been forgotten by history? There were other mysteries too. We have at Belvoir the amputation kit that had been used to cut off Robert's leg in the midst of the battle. How on earth had it come to be at the castle, which is about as far from the sea as anywhere in the country? And there were 7 cannon on the terrace, said to have been captured by Robert from a French ship of war. How had they got there? And why did he have such a close relationship with his older brother Charles? Why too did Charles, after Robert's death, appear to have abandoned Belvoir Castle, their treasured and much loved family home, and never returned? Had Charles, as a young son and heir, wanted to do something else with his life rather than inherit? I had a feeling that there was more to this than a straightforward story of first and second son. I longed to discover what had really happened to these 2 young men, but I knew I would need someone to help me with all this research. I inherited the castle in 1999 and raised a family which left no time to follow up on my idea. Then my interest was reignited when a chance guest turned up at Belvoir.
Well, I believe you even found a description of what Lord Robert was like. I think you have a quote, don't you?
I do. He was nearly 6 feet tall, with skin that tanned easily, and a body that was said to be beautiful without being feminine. His eyes would grow fiery or soft, according to his emotions. He did not speak much unless he had something important to say, but he had a sense of humour and enjoyed companionship.
And I understand that Lord Robert became a young captain of a 74-gun Resolution, named for Shakespeare's Cleopatra, who kills herself with an asp, as we all know, uttering, "My resolution's placed."
Yes,
but David, you've Robert's own quote, I think, about resolution, which he was heard to say whilst going into battle, and led to the naming of the book.
It was one thing I must say is it was very strange in those days to leap from being an officer on board one ship to being captain of a 74. Usually you went to a frigate or a sloop or something like that first. But I just wanted to get that bit in.
Yes,
He said, "Now you shall see whether I can keep the resolution I have long formed. The flag shall never be struck while I am alive."
It's a lovely term, isn't it? What does it mean, striking the flag?
Bringing it down, surrendering.
Yes.
In very simple terms.
I understand that Robert was brave, maybe a little foolhardy for the time. What happened in the Battle of Chesapeake, 1781, the year before he died? I believe he found again a quote which shows what he was like.
Yeah. Lord Robert Manners bore the ship into the centre of the enemy and narrowly escaped with his life, the peak of his hat being taken off by grape shot.
He certainly had a nautical adventure, didn't he, at those times?
He said afterwards, he felt a slight inconvenience.
Well, there was another inconvenience for him, of course, and we talked about that. Can we talk a little bit more about the sword, or it's called a hanger, I think, and that rather gruesome amputation kit from the times?
We have the kit, not all of it. He must have gone through a lot of pain having that leg removed, and but he rallied for a while and then died 2 weeks later. I actually think he died on St. George's Day.
Yes, well, we've seen gruesome pictures in the past, haven't we, of history of how amputations were carried out in those days. It doesn't really bear thinking about, does it?
No,
Another point I wanted to make was it must have been quite interesting to discover that Lord Robert was born the same year as Nelson, the famous admiral, of course, when the Victory was commissioned. That was 1758. And Robert served on the Victory in 1778, didn't he?
Yes, I know. It's rather strange, that fact, and the fact that he was born the same year and then landed up actually serving on the ship, which I think is rather nice. I went to have a look at Victory, and I felt as if he was watching me in some ways. I felt that as I walked round.
It's a marvellous ship to go and see just down the road here in Portsmouth, and as you say, there's a lot of ghosts, I suppose you'd have to say, on that ship.
I personally wish that they would get on with getting the masts up properly and re-rigging it and so on. I think it's rather sad the way it is at the moment. But that's my personal opinion. I know probably money's a bit short and so on, but I would like to see it re-rigged as a proper sailing ship.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about firing cannons. We've got a lovely little video to show of the cannons being fired atop of Belvoir Castle, but there's quite a story to go with that, isn't there?
Yes, they were captured off a ship called the Protee, which was Lord Robert Manners' first capture of an enemy ship. We still fire them to this day for weddings, and in fact, to make it more recent, on Thursdays when we clap for the NHS, well, every Thursday I fire the cannons as well. Well, I thought it'd be a nice thing to do, so we fired the cannons as well as clapping.
And there's a connection between Lord Robert and the man actually firing those cannons, isn't there?
Robert Osborne. Well, yes. He lost his leg on Tumbledown during the Falklands War, the same leg.
I know Lord Robert is the naval man, but the other brother it also seems like an interesting character, obviously quite different from Robert. A raconteur, a good time boy, I think you might even say. He even risked treason when into opposition with the government. And I think there's quite a nice speech from him, isn't there? Quite controversial at the time.
He opposed what he thought would be a long war with the Americans. He said we should do everything we could to avoid that. And I'll just read what he said. From the fullest conviction of my soul, I disclaim every idea, both of policy and right internally, to tax America. I disavow the whole system. It is commended in iniquity. It is pursued with resentment and can terminate in nothing but blood. Under whatsoever shape in future it may be revived, by whomsoever produced and supported, it shall, from me, meet the most constant, determined, and inevitable opposition. Sorry, invariable opposition.
Well, the book doesn't actually end with Lord Robert's death in 1782. Charles was made Viceroy of Ireland. How did that come about?
Well, I think he was asked by Pitt if he would take up that position, as I think he'd had a few people turn turn the whole thing down, and he had a lot of direction in the end from Pitt and other ministers as to how to do it, and I don't think he did too bad a job. But sadly, he enjoyed his drink, and died aged 33. So he wasn't that much older than Robert, sadly. And there are one or two stories to go with him. Shall we put it that way? He and his fellow friends got so drunk one evening that they decided to go and visit Mrs. Leeson's Emporium, whorehouse, or whatever you would like to call it, in the town. And they went off in whatever number of carriages. But the main one, of course, was the Viceroy's carriage with the manus coat of arms painted on the side. And they all went in, and he went up. Charles went off with Mrs. Leeson, whose maiden name was Peg Plunkett, by the way, and had a nice time. But the one thing they forgot to do was to tell the dragoons to dismount. So they sat on their horses all night with their swords drawn, I understand the story appeared in the Dublin Times or whatever the newspaper was of the day about the whole thing.
It's been fascinating hearing about the book and how it all came about, Your Grace, the 11th Duke of Rutland. Finally, David, how do you feel about the book and having finally found out about your ancestors?
Oh, I'm very proud of the work that Emma and I have managed to put something together which a publisher thought was worthwhile bringing out. Well, I think it was 4.5 years of writing and then 6 months of editing and eventually putting it to bed. Yes, putting it together.
Well, thank you very much for joining us here on the Red Funnel Digital Literary Festival and on the Isle of Wight here, and we enjoyed talking to you from the lovely Belvoir Castle.
All right.
Well, so now let's turn our attention to Majorca, another island, not quite Isle of Wight, but the island in the Balearics, and bring in EmmaEllis. Emma, welcome to the Red Funnel Digital Isle of Wight Literary Festival, and we heard from the Duke there about the book and how it all came together over these several years. But what are you doing in Majorca first?
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, I'm here in Majorca writing another book. I'm here because all the records and documents are here. It's about the family during the last days of the British Empire in East Africa. But so I'm here because the documents are here, and that's the same thing that happened to me with the castle. All the documents were there, so I went and lived up there for 5 years to do the book. And it came about by a very fortunate chance. A friend of mine, Dominic Dobson, invited me one Christmas to go and stay at the castle because he's always a house guest there every Christmas. And I sat next to the Duke at dinner, and Duke was talking to me about maritime history, and I thought, oh, that's nice. And it's quite a niche subject, but he seemed very interested. And the next day he made a particular effort to show me around the castle and to show me the showcase where Lord Robert's sword is, and the amputation kit that's used to cut off his leg in a battle, and the beautiful portrait, Joshua Reynolds' portrait of him. And I thought, well, that's great. I didn't think too much more of it. And then 2 weeks later, he rang me up and offered me a job and said he'd always wanted to write a book about Lord Robert, and would I like to help him? I didn't think about it very long. I thought this is a wonderful opportunity for a maritime historian, because it is a niche subject and jobs don't grow on trees. for that subject. So I said yes pretty quickly.
I mean, that must have been a lightning moment for you, as a maritime historian, being offered the chance to live in the castle for some of the time and go through the archives. It must have been a gift from heavens.
It truly was, and I was given a set of keys to the archives, lovely big jangling keys, this great big door, and it was like C.S. Lewis's wardrobe door. You would go behind it for the day, and you'd be transported into all these different lives, times, worlds, because there's so many detailed papers there from the people over the centuries who've lived at the castle, been involved with the castle. And really, you come out from behind the door at the end of the day feeling that you've been travelling in time.
Was it musty? Was it mildewy? I have this idea that there's this lovely film set almost.
No, it wasn't. It has actually been beautifully looked after over the years. And David's grandfather, the 9th Duke of Rutland, did a lot of work sorting the papers and binding them beautifully. So it is nicely done.
Where do you start on a project like that? I mean, there's all the archives, and there you are in your dream, down in the archive. Where do you make a start on that?
Well, the first thing we did, in fact, was to discover what else there was, what was known about Lord Robert. That one or two things had been written about him, and also his letters that he wrote from at sea had been published many years ago in a volume of documents. So they were available. So the first thing we did was have a look, and the first thing that we realised was that not very much was known about him, yet at the same time people were interested in him and they wanted to know what his story was. And one of the things that was very noticeable was that he was quoted very much seen as a very typical aristocratic, entitled young man thinking he's going into the Navy, he's going to get fast-tracked to captain, it's all going to be great and he's going to get lots of prize money. And one of the things we started to see was that this was not the right story to tell about him. It was part of the story, certainly, but it was not the full story. There was more to it than that. And we first of all, we set him in the context of the American War of Independence. If you look through the letters, you start to see all sorts of famous names, and you start to realize that he's in amongst very well-known people. For example, he becomes a bit of a protege of Samuel Hood, who after Lord Robert's death takes on, and a few years later, Nelson as his protege. So he's very much moving in circles of names that you can see everywhere. And we looked at the battles, we looked at his locations, and we began to realize that his whole story sat perfectly and beautifully within the context of the American War of Independence. So we had another story going on there behind Lord Robert. We began to realize that through telling his story, we could also tell the story of how Britain lost America. But we needed to know much more about him as a young man, why he died so young, why he was acclaimed, why there was this monument. And we went right back to everything we could find. It was very exciting. I mean, some of the things were already beautifully bound together and were easier to find. This had been done by the Duke's grandfather. He beautifully put these things together. So we could take these leather-bound volumes and just read through the letters, so that was fine. But there's a very good archivist at the castle called Peter Foden, and he helped us. He spent a lot of time digging bits and pieces out for us. We went up into one of the towers which is unused. We found boxes and boxes of little bundles of paper tied with string, which had probably actually never been touched since they were put there in the 18th century. And there's a whole other backstory as to why they hadn't been touched, because there's a lot of sadness and emotion that happened at the end of the story, which meant a lot of this stuff was just put to one side in all the things that happened. But anyhow, I digress. So we undid all these bundles and we found all sorts of little clues, such as amazing amount that was spent on Lord Robert, on the nurse when he was born. Quite a lot of money. We found accounts from when they were at Eton together. We found all sorts of little clues that we were able to piece together, and a number of surprises. And there were things like, for example, the marriage settlement between his parents was written on 246 sheepskins. It was so huge because it was so complicated. And there was a reason for that, very important reasons for all these things. And Peter Foden, the archivist, who's very experienced in interpreting these, he was able to go through those and help us a lot with what some of these things actually meant. Because it all had very great meaning and significance. And so we went back, and one of the first things we discovered was that Lord Robert's mother had died when he was just 2 years old. And now you might say, well, okay, you know, lots of people died in those days, sure. But it had implications. Very soon afterwards, Lord Robert had an older brother who was heir to the Duke of Rutland at that time. Very soon after the mother died, the older brother died, shifting the whole inheritance sequence. That then meant that their father was away at war, the Battle of the 7 Years' War, becoming a very famous army general that all the world admired, and all the pubs were named after him, the Marquis of Granby. Lord Robert and his brother, Lord Robert went to Eton aged 5, which was quite young at that time, even for those times. So again, that had implications. Charles is now the heir. The brother that's one step older is now the heir. Again, that throws everything into another dimension. Then the father comes home, very, very famous. He's very benevolent, he's very humanitarian, and he's very loved by all his army people. And so he's courted to go into politics. He goes into politics. He finds that it doesn't suit him. He's an army man. He makes decisions. He does all, you know, he's good at that sort of thing. He's not good at all this backstabbing and things that are going on. And the problem with America is now erupting. The whole taxation of America. Should we be taxing or not taxing America? And he gets drawn into politics, and he doesn't do very well. And he gets drawn into scandals. He hits the bottle. He spends all his money, and he dies young in 1770, a broken man. And this has a huge impact on his two sons. The two reasons. One is they're in his shadow. They want to prove themselves and his legacy. Secondly, the Marquis of Granby's father, who's the third Duke of Rutland at this time, he's had 15 children, of which 12 he has outlived. Hang on, have I got that right? He had 15 children, 12 who died. And the Marquis of Granby was the 12th of these 15 children who died. He falls apart. He's heartbroken. And he abandons his grandsons. He refuses to give them any money. He refuses to take any interest in them. They're left in the care of a grandmother who's already an old lady and suffered her fair share of tragedy. She steps in to look after these boys and their moral upbringing, and she can't even afford to buy them stockings and shoes and things to go to school. I mean, it's quite interesting, all these things. So we follow this story, and then the boys have to decide what they're going to do when they leave school, and their characters are emerging while they're in school. By the way, Lord Robert's obviously quite studious, and he likes reading the classics and so on. Charles is the raconteur, the one who's having fun, and his grandmother's warning him not to get into debt like his father. She's giving him very stern warnings. She's worried about what's going to happen to him, she can see. And she's not so worried about Lord Robert. So, but then even so, she keeps an eye on them.
What about, in those archives, pouring through all these fantastic objects and revealing all sorts of surprises? What about those discoveries? Anything you didn't expect to find?
Yes, many. And one of the things that was quite intriguing, because fairly early on we realised that we had to tell Charles's story as well as Robert's, because it just didn't make sense. All the letters, the two brothers were thrown together so closely, and this was one of the surprises, was just how emotionally close they were. They were at Eton together as little boys, and they kept this very strong bond. And we found evidence eventually that Charles, to some extent, when Lord Robert died, that had a huge impact on Charles. And I won't give away all the story, but he was devastated when Lord Robert died. And one day, the Duke and I were looking in a display case that he's got in the sitting room, and there's a little clutch bag in there, and that was said to belong to Charles's wife, the beautiful Mary Isabella. And we decided one day we'd open this case in the castle, and we opened this clutch bag, and in it we found a lock of hair from each of Charles and Robert that had been placed inside this clutch bag, and then then locked away. And it was like, oh, somebody knew how close they were, and they wanted them to be together. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was Charles. He wanted, as I said, his father, the Marquis of Granby, died prematurely, and Charles wanted to follow his footsteps into politics. Now, Charles annoyed everybody in his circle by going in underage. He got himself elected unopposed as a member for Cambridge University. It annoyed Lord Mansfield, who had been keeping an eye on him. It annoyed his grandfather, it annoyed his grandmother, because they were all Tories in a way. And not so much the third Duke, but his grandmother, who was his guardian, was a Tory. And Charles went in as a Whig, and the thing about the Whigs were that they were in opposition to the government, and opposition was not allowed, it was not formal as it is. This was very, very early. This was just before opposition became formal, and in fact Charles was part of that process. But he went in very strongly opposed to the war with America, which was boiling and brewing at this point. And he gave a tremendous speech, which he got quite well known for, where he absolutely said, no way, it's just going to end in bloodshed. No way should we be doing this. This was his maiden speech. So everybody thinks, wow. But the thing is that Lord Robert at the same time has gone into the Navy. And now Lord Robert, Lord Robert thinks he's going to get preferment. He thinks he's going to fast track, but he can't call on what he thinks he can, because his brother, his father's dead. His grandfather isn't interested. He doesn't have any of his own money, and his brother's gone into opposition. And Robert knows that he might have to fight the Americans, but Charles doesn't want to fight the Americans. So these two brothers are on opposite sides of the fence. Now, what's going to happen, and what's going to happen to Lord Robert? I mean, Lord Robert is going to have to prove himself. He's not going to be able to say, well, my brother's the 4th Duke of Rutland, just make me into a captain. I mean, he gives it a good go, which is why he's to some extent misunderstood. But the Navy was nothing, it was much more of a meritocracy than I think a lot of people realise. They didn't want aristocratic buffoons running ships that had, say, 700 men on board. That's a lot of responsibility, the lives of the men, the ship, and so on. So they actually wanted, on the whole, most of the people that got promoted to captain were competent seamen. There are examples of pushing and poking and prodding and people being where perhaps they shouldn't be, but Lord Robert was going to have to prove himself.
There's a lot there because with respect to the army, you're going into the army and it's fighting, and it's corralling men to get them to fight for you. But on a ship, you've got to have all of that information about and knowledge and experience of sailing a ship at sea and all of the things that go with that. And that's not something you can learn overnight, is it? Or indeed get the respect of the crew that you're going to command.
You're absolutely right, and I mean that's the earlier you went into the Navy, the better. And Lord Robert went in age 14, and if anything, that was slightly too late. They really liked them younger if they possibly could. So he was already slight disadvantage going in at 14, and he then had to do several years as a midshipman. He had to do his time, and he had to go up the rigging and all the things that everybody else had to do, and he had to carry on learning as well. There was a schoolmaster on board, so he could learn navigation and so on, and keep up his general learning of languages and all sorts of things. But he really had to know his stuff and learn his stuff and do his time. And he got very, very frustrated because he began to think that he was actually quite competent and quite good at it all, and he couldn't really understand why it wasn't possible to move on.
In your studies in maritime history, did paths cross? In other words, I remember that bit, and I learnt about that at so-and-so. Did those paths cross with Lord Robert and his history?
Yes, very much so. And I think the wonderful thing for me about Lord Robert was the insights that it gave me into a period that I thought I knew something about, having studied it. And I did. But of course, I think what perhaps I didn't know was the great, the different sort of understanding that you get when you really go into a person's life in great detail. You really understand their family, the emotions, the influences upon them. And it's very easy when you study something like maritime history to get focused on the battles and the, what happened and why did the French come into the war, and why did the Spanish come into the war, and were some naval ships better than others, and were the British naval, and all that stuff is very interesting, but the motivations that lie behind the people involved are often much more, there's more to it than might meet the eye. And we were very keen to show the very human side of this, and we had several mentions of the women and wives. And Lord Robert, we don't know anything about his, we were able to speculate about one possible liaison, but he was very focused on his career, and he wasn't dashing around with a girl in tow in any obvious way. And you might say that, how does that detract? But no, not at all, because actually Charles was quite the opposite, and he had lots of women in tow, so there's plenty of balance there. But I think that, and we had the wonderful Richard Woodman, Captain Richard Woodman, who's a very experienced maritime historian, who looked through the manuscript and very much made sure that the technical side of things were correct, the descriptions of battles. We went to the Public Records Office and we looked up the ship's logbooks, and it's quite incredible. The records that were kept are just unbelievable. We knew where Lord Robert was every day of his life for several years because it's recorded in the logbook. And there were mentions of him from time to time, his own entries. And we were able to piece together where his ship was in the battles and what part he took. But Richard Woodman helped us make sure that we could be authentic with the descriptions of the cannons firing and those sorts of things. So huge gratitude to Richard for that. And we, David, the Duke, and I very much looked at made sure that the human side was as correct as we could get it without trying to be objective, and the Duke was very, very good about that, not trying to present his family in any particular way.
I was going to say it's quite difficult, isn't it, because you have someone who represents the history that you know about. So remaining objective for that, it must have been quite a balance for you.
That was very tricky, and particularly when Lord Robert died, there was a very great deal of flattery and praise that came to Charles. Oh, you know, your brother was the most promising young man in the Navy. How the Navy's lost such, you know, this is a terrible, terrible thing, and etc. etc. And I don't doubt, of course, that some of that was flattery, because that's how it worked in those days. You know, there weren't sort of a social security system like we have now, and people were dependent on patronage. You know, if you could get in with help from somebody with a position, it could be a good thing. So yeah, I'm sure some of it was. There's no doubt that some of it was flattery. But there's also evidence as well that we looked at to show that actually Lord Robert was a good captain in his own right. And one of the interesting things was in their logbooks, they used to have to record how many men had deserted from the ship. And we found that actually day after day, month after month, Lord Robert wrote in no run men, which means that he had no deserters at all. And I think there was great loyalty to him. And he looked, I mean, again, it's hard to interpret. I mean, he was very humanitarian like his father, and he looked after people. There's no doubt about that. He took great care. And there was a lad he was standing next to whose leg was blown off, and Lord Robert made sure the lad was sent home with a letter that he was to take to his brother, the 4th Duke, to make sure he got looked after and that sort of thing. And there's another lovely story of when some deserters for another ship were due to be hanged, and Lord Robert had to go and tell them that they were going to be hanged. The fleet commander changed his mind and said, no, they don't need to be hanged anymore. And Lord Robert had to go to these men and tell them they were not going to be hanged. If I may, I'll just read you the bit. On the resolution, witnesses recalled that the suddenness of this order of mercy was too powerful for the mind of Lord Robert. He endeavoured to speak after many attempts, but could only just get out in short, "You are all pardoned." And bursting into tears, he was forced to quit the deck and retire to his cabin. I always feel quite emotional myself when I read that little speech. I think he was very compassionate. Because we know he was flogged as a child, because there's a story of when he and Charles ran away from Eton. In 1768, there was a rebellion, and they, against authority of the prefects, and some of the boys all decided to bunk off school and went home. One of the boys was called Lord Petersham, and he was the son of Lord Harrington, and he went back home to see his father. And there was a nice story we found about him, and as well as the two brothers. So Lord Harrington opened the door to his son, and he told him to go straight back to school. And his son said, "Sir, consider I shall be damned if I do." To which his father responded, "And I will be damned if you don't." And the boy said back to his father, "Yes, my lord, but you will be damned whether I do or not." And then the Charles and Robert, they did a similar thing. They went back to their father's home in London, not Belvoir Castle, because Belvoir Castle was the country home of their grandfather, the 3rd Duke of Rutland. So they went to London, and they knock on the door, and Lord Granby says, "Well, boys, what brought you here?" They replied, "We have left Eton." "So I perceive." And they say to him, "Oh, we have all been used so ill. Dr. Foster has driven the scholars away, and we have done as the rest, and so have come home." Very well," responded their father, with every appearance of his customary easy-going generosity. "And you would like to go to the play this evening, hey, boys?" "Oh, yes, sir, you are very good, sir." "Yes, you shall go there tonight for your own pleasure," affirmed the Marquis, "and tomorrow shall return to Dr. Foster and be flogged for mine." And as the story has it, Granby kept his word and sent the boys back to school to be soundly thrashed. So when Lord Robert goes into the Navy and witnesses things like the flogging around the fleet, I mean, let me tell you, I don't want to give the wrong and unbalanced impression, because the Navy was not all flogging. And there was a lot of humanitarian efforts, and they divided the men into watches so that each watch would have somebody looking after them and knew the names of all the men in their watch. Because of 700 men, it's difficult for, say, the captain to know everybody's name, so they divided them up. So it was a lot of effort. Robert knew a lot about scurvy. There was no official remedy for scurvy at that time. The ships were not being issued with lemon juice at sea and so on, that they were a bit later. But Lord Robert was very well aware of what was going on, and he was making sure that his men got vegetables whenever they could, and he was we've got evidence of this, it's not, that he was taking care of his men, and he didn't want to flog his men. And there was this other chap on one of the other ships who was a flogger, and Lord Robert used to say to his men that he wasn't going to flog them, but if they carried on doing whatever it was they were doing, he would send them off to the other ship and they would get flogged. And that apparently did the trick. So, yeah.
What was the high point? What's the low point? I mean, it's a standard kind of question, but there must have been quite a few.
The high point was just very much discovering that we felt that we had a story to tell, and that this was more than just a family, more than just telling a family story, that there was a wider story, and that through the two brothers we could tell the story of the American War of Independence and how Britain lost America, with Charles with all the sea battles, and Robert with all the sea battles, and Charles at home dealing with all the politics, and the relationship between them. So that was a huge high point. So then comes along a low point when we really start to think, oh, actually, is anyone going to want to publish this? We put all this work and time and effort and energy in. You don't know. It's very easy to doubt your. You sort of have confidence, and yet at the same time you doubt, and then you write off and get one or two rejections and so on, and then and as I say, it was very wonderful to be sort of supported by Richard Woodman, who was very much who was very positive, and also a wonderful tutor of mine from Greenwich Maritime Institute called Roger Knight, who was very supportive. But then this wonderful high point when we get the go ahead with the publisher, Head of Zeus, and they say they want to publish it, and the emotion when you've been on this journey with these two young men, these two interesting, passionate, emotional young men, and you've discovered their story and you put it down on paper. And also the Duke's own passion since he was a child, of wanting to tell this story, of believing that there was a story to tell, of his grandfather putting together the showcase with Lord Robert's items in it, wondering how and why the amputation kit was there. How on earth did that come back to the castle? The bottles of wine that he had with him on the ship, the cannon on the terrace, which was said to have been from a ship that he captured during the American War of Independence. All these mysteries, all these things that we didn't understand, that the Duke had always wanted to know ever since he was a child. And we put the story together, we found out, we closed the loop on most of these things, and then somebody actually wanted to put it into print. It was a very wonderful moment, and we had a fabulous party to celebrate.
Well, Emma, and thanks to yourself over there in Mallorca, and of course to the 11th Duke of Rutland up there at Belvoir Castle. Thanks very much for talking to us about Resolution, Two Brothers, and A Nation in Crisis.
Well, may I please also say a big thank you to all the team at the digital version of the Red Funnel Isle of Wight Literary Festival. I believe a huge amount of effort has gone into making this possible during these times of COVID and all that. And a big thank you to you, Stephen, for your help with it all. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to the Duke for giving me the chance to write Resolution with him, to all his family who were very kind to me, to all my friends around the Belvoir estate, all the castle staff who were immensely kind towards me during the whole process of writing, and then various people like Richard Woodman, Roger Knight, and other people who helped. And of course the publishers, Head of Zeus, who believed in us and believed in the book and were very supportive. A very big thank you to all of you. I hope I haven't left anybody out. There's so many more names I could mention, but thank you to everybody. You know who you are.
Our thanks to David Rutland and EmmaEllis. Thank you very much for participating in the Red Funnel Isle of Wight Digital Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwell's Bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors who've supported the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it would be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge. Special thanks to Red Funnel, who've been our title sponsor for many years, and, as well as providing financial support, offer a warm welcome to speakers and visitors to the island for the festival.